evening and welcome to what is going to be a very interesting discussion on sustainability, waste and more. I would first like to introduce Susan Mathews, who's sitting here in the middle. She's a former lawyer who worked with the United Nations and whose areas of work have been in development and human rights. In May 2021, Susan started a digital magazine, darkandlight.com. That's darknlight.com. And she will tell us more about the e-zine in a few minutes. In discussion with Susan today is architect Dean D'Cruz. Anyone who lives in Goa will know Dean, who has been very active on different critical issues related to development and sustainable living for all of us. So welcome, Susan, welcome, Dean. And Waylon D'Souza is the third person on the panel, who is a transdisciplinary artist and designer doing regenerative systems design. Now, I know some of you all, including me, will be asking what that is. And I'm also waiting to hear what that covers, Waylon. I know you've done a lot of work with waste and product design, but I'm waiting to hear about regenerative systems design. Yeah? Thank you so much for being here. And I'm really looking forward to hearing all of them, and we'll hand over to Susan without further ado. Thank you all for being here. And just to one short point is there are 3 books which you will see later, because this is a session which is science and literature, the crossover between science and literature. And the 3 books that you'll see over there are Invisible Cities by Italo Calvino, Incantations Over Water by Sharanya Manivanan, and Alexine Pauline Gums, which is, the title is Undrowned. They all cover very different topics, but all related to today's discussion. Thanks and enjoy.
Thank you, Divya.
Thank you, Divya. And maybe I should start by saying that Divya and I are very old friends. We were in law school together and were up to no good. And after I left India, I lived in Europe for many years. And Divya started this beautiful bookshop, Literati, that we're all sitting in. And it's a real pleasure for me that when I started this magazine in 2021, everything that we've done has been online. And this is really the first live event that we've had the pleasure to do. And it is so wonderful that I'm able to do it with her. So thank you so much, Divya, for helping organize this. Yeah. And really, just what an incredible space. And thank you so much to Dean and Waylon. We've just chatted a little bit. And I think we're really looking forward to the conversation we're going to have with you all. So I'm going to start by actually quoting from one of the books that Divya mentioned, which is Undrowned, which is written by a poet from Durham, North Carolina. And her name is Alexis Pauline Gums. And she writes in this book, "I like to think that we are all living in the long water prayer of the blue whales, that meditative sound that travels hundreds of miles underwater. This long water prayer and other such meditations and ruminations are really what inspires and sustains the digital magazine Dark and Light that we launched in May 2021. We started the space, and here I would like to introduce my partner and husband, Shukrit Bhattacharya, who's there. He's stalwart, long-suffering, and amazing. And we started the space to explore storytelling around nature, arts, science, culture, and social justice. And we wanted to do it through experimental collaborations and often a playful traversing of boundaries. The name of the magazine actually is partly inspired by Grateful Dead lyrics, because I'm a big fan. And it's also about eschewing binaries and embracing Keats' negative capability, which really speaks to an open, receptive stance and an acceptance of the unknown, or even unknowability. So our projects often confront givens, fixities, and we explore cuts between nature and culture and humans and non-humans, for a start. So we're going to do a screening of a film that we made, which is Leonia. But before we do that, we're going to also hear from Dean and Waylon about affluent lifestyles and cities, closed loop systems, utopian and dystopian scenarios, and possible solutions. And before they do that, there are a few things that I would like to share about what I have learned personally from conversations that we have had on our website through our podcast, The Subverse. So one thing that I would like to start with is the last interview that we did this season, which was with Dilip de Kunha, an architect and planner. In his work, he has critically questioned the drawing of lines between land and water and the use of maps as colonial tools. So in his work, he says that through drawing a river as contained between two lines, the first colonization takes place of land over water. Rivers in this imagination originate from a source, they follow a course, and when they exceed the lines, they become flood. In his view, in this articulation, a wetness which is everywhere is now somewhere, contained in place, and rain becomes a visitor, turned ephemeral. So he says that rivers have colonized rain. This in turn dictates how we build our settlements and create elaborate water infrastructures. So in this imagination, all the world is a drained. The city is a drained settlement. I really learned a great deal from this conversation with him. And at least for me, some of the takeaways were that we generally tend to prefer the solid over the liquid, dry over wet, and the rigid over the fluid. We are uncomfortable with the inherent moisture all around us and in us. And here's just a generalization. Maybe this is not the case in Goa. So water was a predominant theme in the Subverse season that we had this year. And two other conversations for me really stood out. And in this one, in challenging ideas around kinship and the separation between humans and non-humans. One conversation was with Sharanya Manivannan and her lovely graphic novel, Incantations Over Water, where she speaks about mermaid lore from Batticaloa, Sri Lanka. The second conversation was with Alexis Pauline Gums, who I referenced at the start. Now, she wrote a remarkable book called Undrowned, which is a story of breathing at scale, of learning how to breathe in unbreathable circumstances. And she does this through listening to kin, in her case, Black feminists and ancestors, and marine mammals, who also share histories of horror during the Middle Passage and transatlantic slavery. In 19 movements, she doesn't call them chapters, we are encouraged, amongst others, to breathe, listen, be present, refuse, honor boundaries, and respect our hair. Now, in the first season of our podcast, there were also two other conversations that will resonate strongly with some of the themes we're going to discuss today and hear more about from Dean and Waylon. The first was one I had with Nithinan Jairaman, an activist and journalist from Chennai, who spoke of Porambuka, or the commons, and the losses that have occurred in terms of the commons. And another conversation was with Jisha Menon, who wrote a book called Brutal Beauty, Aesthetics and Aspiration in Urban India. With a focus on performance studies, her book turns to artworks, performances, and aesthetics to examine the aspirations and anxieties generated in the wake of liberalization in India. So taking into consideration various works of art, paintings, installations, photography, films, theater, live performances, visual art, Brutal Beauty argues that neoliberalism exceeds its descriptors as an economic, social, and political phenomenon. In particular, and this I think is an area that is of real interest for me personally, which is that she also looks at artistic engagements with obsolescence and waste to examine the systemized human degradation that becomes part of the market calculus of value and waste. So no account of growth and garbage in India is complete without an understanding of the ways that waste pickers themselves begin to be identified, not only with trash, but also as trash. One thing that was very clear from this excellent book, which was also pointed out in the conversation with her, is that the artists who were discussed in this book, they exist in a dialectical relationship of receptivity and responsibility to the environments from which they emerge. suggesting an inextricable connection between arts and social worlds, something we'll hear more, I'm sure, about from Waylon, whose own work echoes this. Now, some questions we have not explored yet in our projects, but that fascinate me, and I want to put it out there for our discussion. And this in particular is inspired by the work of Meera Subramaniam, who wrote an amazing piece called The Nature of Plastics in Orion magazine. Now, there's no doubt that plastics are woven throughout ecological and biological systems, great and small. But she asks in the article, what role have plastics played in species interactions? How do beetle larvae live for weeks ingesting nothing but polystyrene? How do entire marine ecosystems survive transoceanic journeys on plastics? What is the natural and unnatural world we are making for ourselves? And then she goes on to say, and this is so beautifully written, as plastics degrade, so do the barriers that once seemed so defined and distinct between inert and organic, between outside a body and its interior, between science and art, between present and future, even between what is living and what is not. So once we had done this podcast episode that I mentioned with Jisha Menon on brutal beauty, we decided to do a follow-up with a short film based on Italo Calvino's Invisible Cities, which is a favorite of mine and Jisha's. Now, Invisible Cities is a remarkable work of geometric and mathematical precision, a tale of 55 cities with 11 classifications, with an imaginary recounting by Marco Polo to Kublai Khan in a garden. Fantastical, bizarre, and enticing, Marco Polo draws us and the Mongol emperor into a tessellation of cities suspended on spider webs with subterranean twins and even a city of sadness. A literary and game and jigsaw puzzle, the book inspired us on our own quest through a maze of waste and pollution, street cleaners and waste pickers, and its real-world echoes by focusing on one of the chapters in his book, which is the city of Leonia, a city of waste and expelling. We are so thankful to Gourav Ogale, a superbly talented artist based in Pune, who visualized this for us, using trash to create the installations that he then weaved into the film. I do hope you all enjoy it, and I look forward to the discussions we will have once Dean and Waylon also make their comments. Thank you.
The city of Leonia refashions itself every day. Every morning, the people wake between fresh sheets, wash with just unwrapped cakes of soap, wear brand new clothing, take from the latest model refrigerator still unopened tins, listening to the last-minute jingles from the most up-to-date radio. It is not so much by the things that each day are manufactured, sold, bought, that you can measure Leonia's opulence, but rather by the things that each day are thrown out to make room for the new. So you begin to wonder if Leonia's true passion is really, as they say, the enjoyment of new and different things, and not instead the joy of expelling, discarding, cleaning itself of a recurrent impurity. The fact is that street cleaners are welcomed like angels, and their task of removing the residue of yesterday's existence is surrounded by a respectful silence, like a ritual that inspires devotion. Perhaps only because once things have been cast off, nobody wants to have to think about them further. Leonia's rubbish little by little would invade the world, if from beyond the final crest of its boundless rubbish heap, the street cleaners of other cities were not pressing, also pushing mountains of refuse in front of themselves. Perhaps the whole world beyond Leonia's boundaries is covered by craters of rubbish, each surrounding a metropolis in constant eruption. The boundaries between the alien, hostile cities are infected ramparts where the detritus of both support each other, overlap, mingle. The greater its height grows, the more the danger of a landslide looms. A tin can, an old tire, an unraveled wine flask, if it rolls toward Leonia, is enough to bring with it an avalanche of unmated shoes, calendars of bygone years, withered flowers, submerging the city in its own past, which it had tried in vain to reject, mingling with the past of the neighboring cities, finally clean. A cataclysm will flatten the sordid mountain range, canceling every trace of the metropolis, always dressed in new clothes. In the nearby cities, they are all ready, waiting with bulldozers to flatten the terrain, to push into the new territory, expand, and drive the new street cleaners further out.
Yeah, good evening, everyone. As an architect, I'm fairly guilty of a lot of the destruction our community does on the environment, and I mean, we consume about 40% of the energy. In building, we create amount of waste. We use raw materials which are destructive to nature. In fact, so when we started practice about 40 years ago, we started off as low-cost architects, building the very Laurie Baker-like style, and we've heard of him, where it was more craft sort of building. But as we progressed, we got into an architecture that was far more conventional. And it was 40 years ago was a time when sustainability wasn't even a word that was used. It was just a very low-cost way of building. When one talks about sustainability, really, I think cost is a factor which can actually address sustainability. Today, we have a lot of greenwash in terms of systems and technologies and materials which they say are green and sustainable, but that really doesn't take place. So where has it really come from, and why are we in this situation? So if you look at the Earth itself, the Earth has got its lithosphere, its biosphere, its atmosphere, its hydrosphere. And for centuries, man has actually tapped into the biosphere, which is basically the surface skin of the Earth, which has had, natural materials, maybe surface rocks, and used that in the building industry and for all the other tools that man has needed. But in the last 100 years or so, we've actually tapped into the lithosphere, which has given us coal, metals, oils. And for centuries, of course, the Earth has been able to deal with these natural, dealing with the wood that's rotting, dealing with other materials that can naturally degrade and recycle naturally. But the Earth hasn't had time to really respond to the other pollutants that have come out from the lithosphere of oil and coal and other metals that have come out, and which have created, issues and problems and pollution for us. So we need to look at how can we actually go back to these traditional systems? How can we replace it? One learning that we had, from practicing 40 years ago was how do we create an architecture that is aspirational architecture that's more humane, an architecture that's more crafted. Unfortunately, today the aspiration for architecture is something which is, glossy, which is taken straight from a magazine, and the aspirations have changed tremendously, and the needs have changed tremendously. Houses have grown in size, cars have grown in size, and everything has become much, much larger. So I think aspiration is one aspect that we need to address in when we look at sustainability and waste generation. About 15 years ago, I got involved in preparing the regional plan for Goa, and it was a great learning experience for me because I realized the potential of actually creating closed-loop systems. Goa consists of about 400 odd villages, of course, about 200 odd panchayats, because each panchayat has about a couple of villages in them. And studying each village, we realized that actually each village was autonomous in a way. It was a closed loop system. You can get your food, your water, almost your energy, and everything mainly needed could be available in a village itself. And here was an ideal closed-loop system where water, energy, materials could be available, food could be available at a nearby source. So I think if one understands and recreates these closed-loop systems in a way, one could reduce the issues of excessive energy consumption, materials waste. When we talked about Italo's work and his thing of the invisible cities, it actually harks back to Venice. I mean, everything is about Venice, really. And Venice, in a way, is closed loop because it's surrounded completely by water. So it looks at a system which is completely isolated from everything around. And how does one actually create this recycling of stuff in a way within the city? But most of our cities are not. I mean, if you look at Bombay, all the water comes from outside, the food comes from outside, all the resources come from outside. And we keep on, cities are an endless pit of consumption where all the resources come from rural areas, tapping into that. If we look at Los Angeles, all the water comes from areas which have created deserts all around it. So we need to look at how can we actually create systems which are far more close network, systems which are supportive at a much closer distance and proximity to its place of use. And you also mentioned on the commons. I mean, the comunidad in Goa, we have a unique system called the comunidades, which is basically each village taking care of its land collectively. And the uniqueness of it is that in a comunidad system, the land is commonly owned, and all the fields, the forest areas, everything are leased out annually to people to get the resources from. So if you're not bodily able to actually harvest the land or till the land, you get a share in the profits. So whoever's tilling the land actually gives a part of it to the comunidad. So everyone benefits in the comunidad system, whereas today, this individual ownership benefits only the people who own the land. So it's a far more equitable system that we've lost over the years. So yeah, those are just points that I thought I'd mention.
So it's interesting. Can you hear me? So it's interesting how you brought up at the start Undrowned, the book, and about whales, because just 2 years back I was working on an installation where I was interacting with scientists from Alaska, and they were recording whale communication, and we were trying to see if we could decipher it and translate it into an art installation of sorts. And also with some scientists in Austria who was researching phytoplankton, and how it's connected together, and how whales consume plankton, and how they have kind of had this communication over continents, even in their migration, it's transcontinental, it's interoceanic communication which goes beyond thousands of miles, which we've just achieved just a century back, if I may say. So they go way back in terms of understanding the Earth as a biosphere compared to us. They literally can see the Earth and its oceans, what's under the water, in 3D with their echolocation. So that was quite interesting. And I also was trying to make the connect with how organic matter, whether it's again plankton or dead whale or dinosaurs, as they say, sank to the bottom of the ocean and then got covered up and became what is current day petroleum. So it's like a blurry line between what's artificial and what's organic. It's all in these larger karmic cycles, and how phytoplankton is getting light from the sun and then converting it into other forms and finally translates into a whale. Similarly, how we are kind of there's this transmutation of that energy back into light energy when you look at optic fiber cables laid in the ocean floor, for us to communicate. So, looking at these larger patterns over eons of time, Coming to like more current day, you know, ways of how we operate as a species in terms of where we have a lot of boundaries, like a lot of us with our limitations. Dean was mentioning about like ideas and how far they can go and our physical limitations as a species, and how we've developed in you know, continents and certain ecosystems, and over time through trade and commerce we've kind of, you know, now multiplied like on steroids with capitalism. We've come to produce a lot of detritus, you know, just nature does produce detritus too. And I was looking at those cycles through like how we have our current day permaculture principles of, you know, how to connect waste in closed cycles. Like we always look at like leaves, like even whether you're like, we've had this Indo-colonial education of creating like clean spaces where even locals look at leaf litter as something to be like pushed to the corners or swept aside, and even because of influence from urban places, also what you mentioned as aesthetics, you know. So I mean, maybe I'm wrong, but for some reason it could be even good that Indians seem to like to live in squalor, whether rich or poor. Like it's not like garbage out of sight, out of mind. So, you know, they don't mind having a great luxury matchbox apartment, or like Villa Charles of Goa, as a writer out here put it. It's quite an interesting read. So, you know, like you see the garbage around you, you know, and that's what influenced me to kind of see how I, as a part of a, you know, ticking organism, like which is humanity, how do I kind of, you know, complete the cycle as an individual, or like a rag picker. I was literally a rag picker going around with people collecting garbage off the streets and then upcycling them, trying to add value, rather than looking at a centralized system where we just, out of sight, out of mind, where we just send it out to a garbage dump or recycling plant where they look at chips packets as something which can't be recycled, because the energy which would go into separating that plastic and metal is not really possible with centralized systems of using science and tech to address these issues. Looked at it as a raw material which could have much higher value, processed in the way I thought would be, I experimented with, as opposed to it sent in trucks burning more petroleum to like a larger centralized unit which would incinerate it under the excuse of producing energy and kind of mitigating the pollution which would come out of the excretion of like the gases too, you know. So yeah.
Thank you so much, Waylon, and thank you, Dean. I think you both made really interesting points, and I'm sorry, I suddenly seem to have lost my voice. Yeah, thank you.
I wouldn't mind one of these.
Yeah, okay. Sorry.
Want me to fill in till you?
Yeah, why don't you? But you can invite questions.
Yeah, so when you, like, it's kind of quite intriguing how you brought up Wales and then transcended through like the different examples, which I found a lot of resonance with. And so I was wondering, in your kind of journey while talking through these different people, what were your insights on, you know, the cities and suburbs that you've moved through, and you know, what could be the possible futures, what people are thinking about or imagining, which then, you know, an idea sets root.
Thank you. Thank you, Waylon. And maybe what we could do is we can invite a few more questions, and I'll definitely answer yours. And then we can sort of go through the panel and have a larger discussion. Would any of you like to ask a few more questions, and then we can address it?
I want to ask a question about the smart city business that we've heard about in Panjim. And I mean, it seems like the whole city is dug up, and I can't understand what the smart city is supposed to be. Dean, the question is for you.
Yeah, well, I think the term smart city is completely wrong for what they're doing to the city, because, I mean, a smart city is supposed to make cities more livable, more equitable. What they're doing in Panjim, at least, is just beautification. And when we talk about smart cities, it's really about creating equitable situations, city which is caters for everyone. Most of our cities are now catering for, the affluent, or as Suzy said, the affluent society that we have today. And if you look at, say, things that are happening in Bombay, for example, the coastal roads, and everything, they're catering to just 1% of the population of Bombay. So a lot of these solutions in terms of getting technologies into these cities doesn't really serve the lower sections of society and make life more comfortable to them. So sadly, these interventions are really not working very well, and most of them are just political gimmicks. Yeah. Well, I just wanted to talk about where we've gone wrong in terms of architecture in our cities. Yeah. And a lot of our architecture is very industrialized. It's using materials and systems which are highly industrialized, and we've lost over the centuries that a traditional architecture that was far more craft-based, a traditional architecture that used materials that were sensible, that responded to the climate sensibly. But we are seeing movements throughout the world, especially in Southeast Asia, of creating an architecture which is what we call a hybrid architecture, an architecture which is stable enough, which uses structural systems which are more conventional, but allow and cater for a softer craft-based intervention. So basically, the main structural systems could be in materials like concrete and steel, which are, of course, high energy intensive, but the rest of it is left for the craftsmanship to actually enter. So materials which are natural materials, could be tree-based materials, mud-based materials, in which you're actually creating livelihoods for people. You're involving craftsmanship to actually enter buildings. And livelihoods is one area that we really need to look at. We're looking at sustainability, because by industrialization, we're actually making people into slaves in the industrial world. They do not get a fair sort of wage. Their conditions are inhumane. And whereas if we actually create a craft base, we can recall an art-based sort of system of into architecture, which gives a much softer built form and provides an aesthetic which is much needed in architecture today.
Thank you. Looks like I have a little bit of my voice back. I just want to respond to what you said, Waylon, and it's so fascinating that you were doing this research with Wales. And one of the reasons why I started with the story of that long water prayer is it's in a way, it was also to echo what you said, which is that some of these ancient sonar technologies are actually perfected by these marine mammals. We have come much later into the picture. So that's one thing. And the second thing, which Alexis Pauline Gumbs does in her book Undrowned, and she points this out very kind of powerfully, is how connected we are with these mammals. So for example, with whales and marine mammals, they're not like fish, they don't have gills. But they have learned to adapt to breathe. And So there's a lot of lessons that we can learn from how these animals have adapted to their surroundings. The other thing that has also happened is, as a result of, you talked about trade and commerce, and it's these very shipping lines and the whole industry around trade and commerce, which has also affected these communications between animals.
True.
Because they can no longer hear each other underwater because of the din from above. So because of the extreme congestion in the sea and the traffic, they are not able to communicate. Pods are not able to communicate with pods. Animals, families are not able to communicate with animals, with other families. And that has also affected how their own songs and their own languages have changed over time. And one of the reasons why I also started with this whole relationship between humans and non-humans, and I ended with plastic, is in a way to kind of just challenge some of those boundaries that we have created, in terms of what is human, what is non-human, what is inert, what is living. And when you talk about coal and petroleum, those were living beings, or what we term as living, which then over deep time became something else. And with plastic, we will have kind of another story, and it'll be interesting to see what that would look like. But one thing that I did hear in a lot of my conversations in relation to cities, and I didn't mention it in particular, is that there are people who know how to negotiate these kinds of lives, whether it be indigenous people or communities that have lived on the riverbanks or on the shores, fishing communities, people who have navigated these lands and these seas, who have knowledge that we have essentially created as, or we have discarded that knowledge. We have not listened to them clearly. And I think there's also a lot to learn from people who have already negotiated and lived with animals or with the land or with forests and other spaces. So I'm also curious to know about you and Dean in terms of, how that also sort of kind of works into kind of, let's say, developing settlements, building architecture. Because a lot of times what happens in cities is that when there is an eviction or a demolition, it's often people who are very much on the, who are either unsettled or, that horrible term informal, who are actually first affected or most badly affected.
Yeah, cities are, turning to very unfair places for the underprivileged. If you look at, say, Bombay and the slum rehabilitation schemes that have been taking place, taking them out of slums and putting them into these 10-story buildings, 10 feet apart. Studies have been done of the health of such people. In fact, the incidence of TB in such buildings is 400 times the national average because they don't get proper light and ventilation. It's almost criminal what's taking place in our cities. Open spaces are being reduced. The experience of the city is only kept with the width of the road and the footpath. So it's extremely limited sort of space. I saw one image that still stays in my mind, and that was a child playing with marbles at the edge of the fence of the golf course, the Willingdon Club. And here you have these acres of land with the rich playing golf, and this child has just got this 2-foot wide pathway in which to play. And so that realize how unfair cities are, to people. And it's only people who have the means that can actually live in the city with any dignity. So it's important that we make our cities far more accessible. There's a friend actually who works with developers in cities now, educating them as to what's needed. So she actually takes them to different parts of the world, the big developers, and shows them examples of how cities can develop in a more equitable manner, where actually developers giving back to the city would bring them goodwill and also improve the real estate value of the land in which they're building in. And so we have to change that myopic perception that developers have of this use the maximum built-up area, grasp as much land as they can, and learn to start giving back to the city to actually improve the city as a whole, and also benefit them by improving the value of land in those places.
Yeah, so it's interesting that Divya brought up the Smart City Panjim venture, and I was interacting with someone who was working on it, and at that point of time, earlier in time, I was commissioned by some real estate companies and masjids to create signage. So at that point of time, using the same philosophy, I created signage out of ships which were being deconstructed, like old wrecks, and created signage out of them, which had like this kind of vintage feel to it. And then, not that I was looking for a deal, but I just showed it to them, the Smart City Panjim committee, and then they were like, "Oh no, we're not going to use this. This was for Panjim Fontanej Mala area, which is quite a old setup." And they said, "We're going to use a lot of LED signage, which again brings you down to like components which would have a lot of plastic and have shorter lifespans." And so the way we are looking at at the word development should be kind of probably directed in another way, where we look at opulent development as the benchmark would be how you kind of create a closed loop system, as Dean mentioned earlier, where all the materials are kind of cycling in that kind of larger system, for say.
Thank you. We'd just like to invite anyone from the audience if you want to make any comments, please.
Thank you. I'm sorry, I came late, so I missed the beginning of what was said, but I kind of was waiting to hear when we talk about waste and sustainability. I'm not hearing any mention of the word caste in India, because I think you can't talk about waste sustainability without mentioning caste and who manages waste in this place, and our region is steeped in caste. And I don't think we can pat ourselves on the back for using a steel straw and changing our light bulbs when the whole sort of basis of where we are when it's like out of sight, out of mind when it comes to our waste. So I just wanted to kind of bring that into the conversation tonight, just to see. I mean, we don't hardly have solutions, but we shouldn't like shy away from talking about this. Yeah. Thank you.
Good evening. Because you are all experts and all the people here are coming just because they want to protect the planet, I wanted to ask you advice about a little tragedy which is happening now in Calangute, which is a very good example of all the things you mentioned. What happened? Because they've been building too many hotels. These hotels are lacking of water and don't know where to put the sewage. So recently, around my house, which is just by the paddy field, the other day, I was suffocating because for 1 week, they've been cutting all the bushes and cutting big trees like those one, more than 30, not even using the woods, but burning them. So for 1 week, I had fire and smoke. The reason is because on the canal, where normally during the monsoon the water is going through, yes, but it's a question, but I have to explain them what's happening for them to give me the question. So they are going to build a road to lead to the paddy field and to build a sewage pumping station. So, of course they need it. That I understand. But to put it around houses where all the dwells are going to be, polluted. And once again, you mentioned the communal land where people used to have, that's communal land, and they are putting it there. So is it a good idea? And as you know, we have the same problem in France. if you build too much, then during monsoon, all the houses around are going to fall apart because you won't have the sponge and the water to go into the earth. So I just wanted to mention that, and if any of three of you has a better idea, that you should mention it to the Panchayat of Calangute, who is saying, go green, go clean, and they cut all the trees. Sorry. Thank you.
You'll have 2 questions to respond to, and then...
I could answer the second one.
Yeah, I'll go for the first. Thank you so much. And, I did mention something in the beginning, but actually thank you for pointing this out. I did mention in my initial presentation that one of the conversations I had was with a professor who works with performance art. And she wrote a book where she looked at different kinds of artworks in cities, to kind of explain the problems with aspirations and anxieties in cities. And one of the chapters she wrote specifically about was waste. And in that chapter, what she did is she looked at different installations that artists had created around waste, and people who pick waste and scavengers, and, the whole kind of the cleaning of waste. And as you mentioned, caste is absolutely central to that. And there's no way we can have a conversation in India without talking about that. And I think that was exactly her point in that particular chapter and book, which is we conflate waste with people who work with waste. They have become trash. They have become waste. So they are degraded. They are not given dignity. So that is very much part of the problem. The other conversation that I had also, because we were focusing on water in the podcast, I spoke to a number of people, and we were looking at kind of the relationship between caste and water. And that's also very fraught, not just because of the waste issue, which is a huge issue, as we all know. It's also access to water. To not be able to have access to drinking water, not having access to wells or tanks. You have the Mahad Satyagraha with Ambedkar, when they had to go and fight for that access to a tank. And these are histories that we have forgotten. So everybody remembers the Salt March. Very few people talk about the Mahad Satyagraha. And I think that some of these histories that have been erased have to be brought back into public knowledge. But I completely agree with you, and just to let you know that absolutely not forgotten or ignored.
I had an insight, like talking about a particular system, like say, for example, the caste system, which is integrated over centuries, you could say, and it's really hard to break down or dissipate a system. So why not use it or infiltrate it and create a new caste and class system where maybe the indigenous tribal community is placed at a higher caste because they are custodians of an ecosystem which provides cleaner water for a dam right ahead, which would provide it to the urban bumpkin who is really not contributing to that kind of custodianship to water. So if we kind of use that same structure, to kind of readdress the issue, I think that's the only way we can start to address. But otherwise, we're in like a bubble, silos of a small number of people addressing that issue, and constantly it's like ping pong ball going around, but it's not really hitting on the larger segments. As you mentioned earlier about Amitabh Bachchan, or like, yeah. So you could make like housing for the destitute out of upcycled materials or traditional materials or vernacular architecture, more sustainable materials, or even like give them your 2 cents that, oh, you should probably use thatched roofs and stick to your mud houses. But if someone who has clout, whether social or political or economic capital, absorbs this, and you create same mansions out of these same materials and processes, and then it becomes like a trickle-down aspiration for the larger segments,
I think the simplest solution to a lot of our problems is really decentralizing a lot of the stuff that we have. The moment we centralize, the problems become much bigger and more difficult to handle. And whereas traditionally all our systems have actually been decentralized, like the village example I gave you earlier. So hence the sewage issue that we have faced. The moment you put it into a pipeline and transport it somewhere and create a sewage plant, is you're creating a problem of its own. And these systems need maintenance. A lot of times when governments put in infrastructure, they take the cost of the infrastructure, but they don't take in the cost of actually maintaining them or replacing them. And those are big problems that eventually come to bear upon the government, who have to keep on taking loans, and they get into greater and greater debt. Goa has a debt of some 30,000 crores or something, which is government. So it's just an enormous amount of money, and they just keep on borrowing from the central government, and it's an endless process. And so we're creating infrastructure which we cannot maintain, we cannot afford even. Whereas we actually keep it at a smaller scale, it's far more handleable. One of the biggest issues really of sewage and the problems is actually the WC, the water closet as we call it. Here you're putting 20 liters of clean, fresh water virtually into the drain. You're polluting it, and then you're trying to clean it up again. So it's one of the most ridiculous inventions, I think, for society. And we have to question these things. I mean, there are now eco-toilets which use composting and everything, but they're not fashionable because they're far more inconvenient, as they say. But actually, it just means a lifestyle change. And really, when we talk about waste, it's all about lifestyle change. It's how can we actually change our lifestyles, make it less consumptive, reduce the amount of change our aspirations. And the example I gave, of course, earlier was when we were talking on our own was if we can actually change the habits of the wealthy, the people who the general public look up to, the actors and the cricketers, they could actually change their ways, the general population would actually start also changing their ways, because they look for them for their lifestyles and they try to emulate the way they live. So there's some cities, for example, we're talking about the sewage system, where they actually have grey water lines. So the sewage system is just basic cleaning, and they use it for watering, the gardens of the city. And rather than just pump it into the sea, Bombay has a tremendous amount of waste, and there are pipelines which go 3 kilometers into the sea, with virtually going untreated into the ocean. And which is really disastrous. At some point of time, it's going to, show up on sea life and destruction and pollution, which can be a complete ecological disaster. Whereas we have natural systems. I mean, Goa has mangroves. A single acre of mangrove forest can treat as much as the whole sewage plant in Panjim, the Tonka sewage plant. So there are natural systems available which we tend to destroy in our development model. So we need to look back at nature and see how nature can actually help us, because nature has systems already in place which we fail to recognize.
Thank you for mentioning about mangrove. Yesterday when I was going in a taxi to South Goa, I was surprised to see some skeletal mangrove which looked like they went through a volcano or something. I saw similar trees in Yellowstone National Park. Later, the taxi driver told that apparently they have been used acid to destroy the mangrove. I was shocked. Could you say something on that, please?
Yeah, I mean, there are various areas, but the most noticeable area is really south of Panjim, as you're going south towards Malgaon, where they've actually stopped water from flowing into the mangroves, because mangroves it's a tidal action where, saline water comes into and feeds these mangrove systems. And they've also used chemicals to actually destroy, because they plan to fill in those fields and use it for development. The mangroves are a protected species under the Forest Act, so it's treated as a forest. But we fail to sort of protect them well enough. And it's all about the connivance of the political system and developers in this destruction. Fortunately or unfortunately, climate change is going to take place. Goa is going to lose 20% of its land because a lot of its land is what they call Kazan land, which is actually below sea level, is protected by bunds. And when that happens, hopefully the mangroves will come back, but because they're quite resilient. But I think the destruction needs to stop at some point of time, and there needs to be people's movement strong enough to take on developers and the political system.
I could address it. So, speaking of to put all of those things together, how basically we don't our ecosystem services are not tangible. So, in terms of economics, you don't put value on the mangroves that this many you have to preserve them at and put in inputs or infrastructure to preserve them, even in terms of not creating a highway where it would let the water flow back and forth. And so therefore, as you mentioned, these spaces are kind of desecrated. So if you do put value to them in terms of monetary value, like this kind of, if there's say probably 10 plots of land, and if one person is deciding to build a 10-story building or even 10 villas, they should be probably paying taxes to the adjacent 10 plots which are retaining their trees. Or if there's agricultural land, it has to go to the common what you could say upkeep of the land, or either if it's private settlement owned land then or orchard land, they should be paid taxes to retain their trees. Otherwise no one's going to value these intangible ecosystem services, and therefore they would just burn it down or clear it and throw in chemicals in there to kill it. So if we as a collective created these kind of demands to various private and public authorities, I think then we could address the issue, because otherwise it's just insular kind of instances. And also, as we were discussing earlier, it's not really Goa's going into debt because of these forms of infrastructure, which is not really helping us as an ecosystem and long-term custodians and residents. It's largely for India to send their burnt-out urban bumpkins to kind of rejuvenate of sorts at a very low cost, at the same time desecrating a land space which is giving them that rejuvenation, which will be obsolete in a couple of years, if not less,
So fortunately, the Supreme Court has recently passed an order where the value of a tree, medium to large size tree, is 75,000 rupees for every year of its life. And we need to use these sort of orders to effectively ensure that they're not destroyed. But it means a lot of a bigger battle with the government and in monitoring what's happening around us.
Dean, I have a question. Could you explain to us who live in Goa especially what the comunidad system, how it works, what is the policy behind it, and what they are meant to do for a village? I live in Pillane, and there is a very large comunidad. So I would like to understand what the panchayat and the comunidad, how do they interact, or what are they meant there for?
Yeah, so the comunidad traditionally is a collective of people who are from that village to take care of, it's primarily agricultural sort of monitoring and development of the village. Comunidades actually jointly own the village land. The houses actually were also where people have houses were originally comunidad lands which were given what they call as affirmaments, so basically like a 20-year lease which is extendable almost in perpetuity. But all the other lands, the field areas, the orchard areas, are supposed to be for the common good of the village. Unfortunately, with of course the liberation of Goa, a lot of central laws have come in and they've set up the panchayats, which are governing systems. There is a bit of a vagueness now in terms of how much the ability of the panchayat to govern comunidad lands. In fact, the case is still in the Supreme Court, and it's so tricky that there's no final order even given on this. Been in the court for almost 30 years of defining what powers the government of Goa has over these common lands. But primarily it's meant for the benefit of the village. Now, the government has, through the constitution, the ability to purchase, acquire some of these lands for public good, which is basically for hospitals and schools and things like that. But definitely not for private use. The comunidad's bodies have the right to actually decide for the other uses on it. So there's still a lot of vagueness of what comunidades can do. But I think a good comunidad can actually use the land effectively for the benefit of the whole village rather than just the members of the comunidad itself.
That's where the problem is.
Yeah, that's it. So a lot of the comunidades, there are a lot of corrupt comunidades, there are a lot of ineffective comunidades. There are a few comunidades which are trying to do good, but they need a lot of legal and planning guidance to really be effective.
Yeah, in some ways, I feel like these are almost the beginnings of many conversations. But there have to be new beginnings also. So I'm going to ask you all to make some of, as they say, closing remarks to kind of wind up this part of the conversation, and then the conversations can go on informally after that.
Go ahead.
Let's do it. Firstly, I just wanted to say thank you to Divya again and to all of you for spending your time with us. And I think for me, the main thing that I wanted to sort of really bring up today was that kind of the how we build our cities, how we deal with our waste. It's not something which is sort of out there. It's also something which is in here. It's in us. So water is in us. It's not just in the sea. We're 70% water, the earth is 70% water. And when we talk about waste, when you talked about waste earlier, we are also a body of waste. We are also a body of excess. We expel, we secrete. But I think it's really trying to understand where we exceed certain systems and where we don't. And I just wanted to kind of tease out some of those questions. We didn't really speak about plastic. And that's another topic maybe, but I do hope that you will think about some of the questions I asked in the beginning. How do we draw lines between what is living and what is not? Between what is inert and what is active? Is time the defining factor here, or is it something else? But again, just thank you all, and thank you so much to Dean and Waylon for joining us, and I'll let them also complete their statements.
Yeah, since you mentioned about plastic, there's an interesting book, if you can get your hands on, it's called The Polyester Prince, which is actually about the Ambanis and the introduction of oil and oil products, which, since plastic is made from oil, actually changed India tremendously. I mean, the GDP of India at the time of independence was supported by 30% GDP. Now it's some 0.05% of the GDP, jute products. So plastic just came in and invaded India in a big way, supported by big industry. Another interesting book that if you can get your hand on to read, is The Third Curve by Mansoor Khan. And Mansoor Khan talks about this whole thing of energy and resources. And it's really about an economy which is going on endlessly. And economies are based on all our natural resources, actually. And our natural resources are limited. And the more we dig into the natural resources, the more damage we cause. And so we have to ensure that our consumption is based on the energy that comes into our system, and that's the sun. And the sun really provides also. We can actually limit the amount of energy we use to the amount we receive from the sun on a daily basis, rather than tap into what the sun has given over millions of years in terms of oil and coal. We would be a far more responsible and sustainable society.
Yeah, so I mean, in a way, we're trying to dispense this knowledge to other sectors and the larger segments, and also address because education is indirectly responsible for consumption patterns. So I came across this documentary by Carol Black, who made Wonder Years. I think Schooling the World, The White Man's Glass Burden. So it was quite insightful to see how we kind of address education and then development. So do have watch it, and I found it quite insightful. Schooling the World, yeah, by Carol Black.
Thank you all, and yeah.
If you want to look at the books, you want to have conversations, and there'll be some beer and lime juice on sale. So feel free, and thank you for coming, and thank you all for such an interesting evening.